Yeah, I used to always think that I was some kind of African princess, that they stole me and one day I'll go back. My mom was killed in a car accident the night before my 3rd birthday. She said, "You know, I don't have any kids, give me one of yours." And you know what he said? My earliest memories are not of my mother, it's waking up in some foster care home with a woman beating us. I couldn't go to church anymore after that. I couldn't sit there and look at him. In 1954, blacks were being spit on. So then I'm in upstate New York and I'm doing some modeling, and we've got a modeling group. And at that point I decided I wanted to be a black Muslim. That's that. My name is Barbara Talley, and I have been in the Maryland area since the mid-70s. I was actually born in upstate New York. I am the mother of 6 children, 9 grandchildren, and many of my kids are around here, only one's in California. They range in age from 18 to 45. So I have 3 sons and 3 daughters. So I have a 45-year-old son, a 42-year-old son, or is he, wait a minute, 1972. Yeah, 43, he'll be 43 December, so yeah, 42. And then I have a 34-year-old son, and a 31-year-old daughter, and a 28-year-old daughter. Well, she'll be 28 really soon. And then I have my 18-year-old. For a career, I'm a speaker, an author. I've self-published 6 books. I've written another 15 books. That's my goal for this fall, to finish the 15 and get them out, because they're all written. They're just in my computer, like that picture that would be in a camera forever. So I want to get all that done, because my father, he was a writer also. He used to write these papers, and he was very, very profound. He lived in Aiken, South Carolina. He was born in 1909. I don't know if you know much about South Carolina, but and black people, not a good combination. There was a lot of endemic, systemic, overt racism. And so my father lived in Aiken, South Carolina. I used to always think that I was some kind of African princess, that they stole me and one day I'll go back and find my kingdom. And then I find on my father's side that his father had come from Ireland. And I'm like, Ireland? And his mother was Native American. And in fact, when we were very young, he would take us in the woods of South Carolina, red clay dirt, and he would go back. And I just have little flashes of memory, little stringing lights. And he would say, "These are your cousins." And they were the Native Americans, and they had the long black hair down to this, and they were very fair. And he said, "These are your cousins." And it was, you know, I guess as a kid, you don't understand what race and all that is, but I just knew they were different. My father used to write these little pieces, and one piece was called, "Are There Two Gods? One for white and one for colored." And he took the Lord's Prayer out of the Bible. He was very profound. He took the Lord's Prayer out of the Bible, and he talked about how black people were treated. His grandmother was Native American, Father Ireland, 1800. But his mother was a black woman who married this Irish Native American stuff, so that's how we kind of got the color in there, which he didn't have, but I have. And he took the Lord's Prayer, and in the first line of the Lord's Prayer it says, "Our Father." And he says, "Whose father are you talking about? Is he white or colored? Or do you think that makes a difference with God?" The next line is, "Who art in heaven?" He says, "If you were there, could you do any better? Here you use a Negro for a footstool and take advantage of his ignorance through your pride and arrogance." My father was so fair that he could pass for a white person. We would travel with him in the South because my dad did migrant work, and we would travel from the north to the South doing migrant work. And I remember a time when somebody came out, my dad went inside, probably one of those times when blacks couldn't go in the front or whatever it is. We were out in the truck because we probably was working in some field. We probably thought we were just the slave hand. Well, slavery was over, but they thought, okay, people still had migrant workers. They just called it migrant workers then. And I remember an old black guy got out of a truck and came over and saw us in the truck, and he said, "What are you doing with that white guy?" I guess he thought maybe he'd stole this. And we're like, "What white guy?" Like him? Like, no, he's our dad. And they're like, "Oh, okay." My father was 7 years old. His father came home. They said a mule came home without him, and somehow he was killed. I don't know if he was lynched. I don't know what happened, because you just didn't, black and white just didn't marry at that time. And he said that the white family tried to take the land, because they have acres and acres of timberland down there. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of acres, but they weren't able to. My grandmother was able to stay there. And it's interesting, they said many of the Scots, that's my maiden name, many of the Scots in Aiken, South Carolina were religious people. They were clergy, which was kind of interesting. And they said that outside in the back of the church, and I want to go down there one day, they said there is a wall that's been built. And so on one side, all the white people that died have headstones, but the black ones, they don't. They have just a little thing in the ground. So they even separated themselves during death, which was, is that just the craziest thing you ever heard? But he grew up mixed and mixed up, because on one hand, he looked like these white people who were his uncles and cousins, but they were people who did not respect his mother and his grandmother. In fact, my brother said that had my grandmother not married my grandfather from Ireland, that she would have been on the Trail of Tears. And I don't know if you've heard of the Trail of Tears, where they marched the Native Americans, across the South out west, and many of them died. They put smallpox in their blankets, and a lot of stuff that this wonderful country has done to its native people. It's an interesting kind of thing, because I was almost an adult before I learned that part of the story, which I could start hating white people, from stuff they've done. It was interesting. So I wasn't that African princess on that side. But, here was somebody that married somebody out of love. That was very reassuring to me. Many of these people could have their way with anybody they wanted to. As I said, my dad did migrant work. So every day at sunrise, he'd wake you up, and you'd go in the fields, and you would work all day. And he would get paid by the probably former slave master, whoever those people still owning those plantations and all those fields. They would pay him money for all of us to kind of work there during the day. And so there was never a question about, do you feel like working today? Are you tired? Is it too hot? My dad was a very strict man. I mean, if he said, get up, you got up, because if you didn't, you get a whooping. And I don't mean a whipping like spank, spank. I mean a whipping. My dad would get a belt, an extension cord. He loved to get switches off the tree. He'd get a switch, and sometimes they peel, and then they would whip you, and you'd have whelps on you. So you learned as a child that if he said do it, you do it. You don't ask questions. It's really interesting, the kind of climate we have today when kids talk back to their parents and say no. We never would even have thought about saying no. And it's interesting, with all of the strictness that they had in the South, and they probably had to so that they could stay alive, we always had to call everybody Miss or Mrs. So my dad, he was an alcoholic, because you can imagine being too dark, a little bit too dark for the whites, and too light for the blacks. So he didn't fit in anywhere. And he was an alcoholic. But he was a very brilliant guy, a very smart guy, and he wrote all kinds of pieces. And it's interesting enough that since, according to my brother, who's much older, the family were religious people. My dad did not grow up with religion. Well, I don't know if he grew up with it, but he never taught us religion. In fact, he was almost blasphemous. He would say, you can throw the Bible in the fire. You don't need to go through anybody to talk to God. Talk to him yourself. So I grew up in an environment where I didn't have to go to church. Many black people, you didn't go to church, you're in trouble. You're going to get a whooping. You didn't have a choice. You didn't argue with your parents. They had to go. And so you got indoctrinated from very early that this is the way everything is. I escaped all of that indoctrination because my dad because he saw his family be hypocritical and what they tried to do to his mom and take the land and all of that, and grew up in this racist stuff. He could not respect these people of religion, and so he didn't. My mom was killed in a car accident the night before my 3rd birthday, but I didn't even have a picture of her until I was in my 30s or 40s. I didn't know what she looked like. I didn't know anything about her. I didn't have one memory, not one. My father was driving back from dropping off some of my brothers at one of the migrant camps to work for the summer, and he was trying to make it back home. And so my mother was driving, and then she was pregnant, and she was tired, so my father said he would drive. So they switched, and so she opened up the glove compartment and, put her head down like this to get some rest. And I don't know, I think he fell asleep at the wheel, and the impact pushed her head into the glove compartment. And we were all in the vehicle too. One of my sisters got her head split open. She's fine now. One got an arm broke. There were passerbys that after the accident, and they were trying to help my mother, so they tried to pull her out, but that broke her neck. And so they had to put her in traction, and she was in the hospital, and the doctors told my father not to take her out of the hospital because if she went into labor with her neck broke. But my father, and I think that's one of the reasons he drank later in life, he said she begged me. He said she begged me to bring her home. She didn't want to be in the hospital. And instead of listening to the doctors, he listened to her. And of course, when she went into labor, she and the baby ended up dying. And then they split us. I think, I don't know if they split us up right then, or they split us up before that because my older brother, I was about 3, he was 12. And he said that he and one of my older sisters of the younger bunch, that he said one day somebody knocks on the door and they said, "Where's your father?" He said, "I didn't know." And he said they just pushed in their way in and said, "Get dressed, we're taking you." So they just kind of took us, and they put my brother and my sister in an orphanage, and they put 3 of us in one home, and they put another one of my sisters in a separate home. So my earliest memories are not of my mother. It's waking up in some foster care home with the woman beating us, saying that we wet the bed. Although I don't have any memories of my mother, I have memories of very religious people, but cruel. They took us to church and, dressed us up. And because I've always had a great memory, I could memorize these long passages in the Bible. So they would stand you up there, and the adults would clap and pat them on the back for being such great Christians and taking in these homeless waifs. I look at it several ways. They did take us in, so I guess we could have not been in, but you got to realize that this is in the 50s. This is 57, 58, 59. You realize Brown versus Board of Education was 1954. In 1954, blacks were being spit on to try to go into a school. So you can imagine the climate. But these people, they took us in, and so their parents or their parents' parents perhaps had been slaves. And so people were very, very strict with their kids. If you did anything, you got smacked because they were afraid if you didn't, you would do it in front of some white person, and then you might die. So our grandparents, and perhaps these people who took us in, their parents had taught them, so they teach them. So, plus there's a passage in the Bible that says, "Spare the rod or spoil the child." So you have people beating their children for the least offense and thinking that you're being spiritual. The Baha'i writing said if you strike a child, you or vilify them, meaning embarrass them, you totally pervert their character. I really had to rewind and relearn everything that I had been taught for a period of time, and eventually was able to sneak across the street and put my hand on that barbed fence. And they pumped water from an outside pump. And she said, they don't come back. And I said, yes, he is. And I'm like, he's coming back. Driving off, and I said, you forgot Betty, you forgot Betty, you forgot Betty. And he said, shut up and sit down, you know. And Uncle Roosevelt wasn't very nice to her. I think he pulled a gun on her or something. In 2011, I went out and interviewed with Oprah's producers about some stuff. I really wasn't ready to go at that point because my daughter's still in high school, but I'm gonna look them up, in a few years.